I did that, you'd be mad at me. You'd get hard.
The January 31st, 2024 special meeting of the City Council and Planning Commission is called to order. The time is 6 p.m. Before we begin, council and commissioners, please put away cell phones. If you have personal business during the meeting, please move for a recess. As a reminder to all attendees, this meeting is being streamed live. The camera is located directly in the back of the council chambers above the clock. Madam Deputy Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councilmember Sullivan Leonard.
Here.
Councilmember Graham.
Here.
Councilmember Johnson.
Here.
Councilmember Crafton.
Here.
Councilmember Vlock.
Here.
Councilmember Rubio.
Here.
Commissioner Seals.
Here.
Commissioner Sage L.
Here.
Commissioner Cottle.
Here.
Commissioner Stafford.
Here.
You do have a quorum of both bodies, Madam Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And Commissioner Cottle, would you lead us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. The first item of business is approval of the agenda. Are there changes to the agenda? Hearing none, the agenda is approved as presented. We are on to persons to be heard. It's a time for members of the public to share their views with the council. This is not a question and answer period or a time for dialogue. Speakers may be referred to administration, or issues raised may be taken under advisement by the council or administration. We have no one signed up. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to come and speak at this time? Seeing no one, we will close persons to be heard. We are now at unfinished business. Madam Deputy Clerk, please read the item by title.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is rewrite of Wasilla Municipal Code Title 16, Land Development Code, and this is Committee of the Whole.
Is there a motion to enter the Committee of the Whole?
Madam Mayor, I move to enter committee of the whole for the purpose of discussing a rewrite of Wasilla Municipal Code Title 16, Land Development Code.
Is there a second?
Second. Commissioner Seals.
It's been moved by by Councilmember Graham and seconded by Commissioner Member Seals to enter the Committee of the Whole. Is there objection to the motion? Hearing none, we are now in the Committee of the Whole. The time is 6:03 p.m. Holly.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Okay, so today we're moving into segment 2. As you know, this is the segment that's going to focus on the permitting procedures and administrative procedures primarily. During the third segment, we're going to be going through the use chart, and that we're going to get much more micro on some of these issues, but this is an issue, this session involves process more than anything. So we're going to go through a PowerPoint that actually Zoe Eisberg, who's here, prepared on segment 2. And Zoe and I are going to do something a little different this time because she did a lot of work on the variance section and also on a lot of the materials and some of the language as well. So she's going to walk you guys through the permitting comparison chart so that you have an idea of what's going on in other communities. And not as you decide what you want to do in your community. So I'm going to start delving into the PowerPoint. If there's any questions on the front end, or is anybody? No, we're good? Okay, we're going to jump right in. Well, no, I think I'm. How do I turn this? All right, let's start again. Sorry, a little bit of technical difficulties there. So we're going to be looking at Chapter 1608, which is Administrative Procedures, 1612, which is the permit approvals by city planner, 1616, which is the Planning Commission approvals, 1634, which are appeals to the Planning Commission, and 1636, which is the appeal to the Administrative Hearing Officer. Before we delve in, there is not much that we're going to be doing with the appeals procedures. Those sections have been rewritten more recently, and we don't have the implications, at least at this stage, when we're just trying to get in front of the very real challenges that were identified in the first two sessions with council, the commission, and the public. So the current permitting structure for the city, I'm just going to read this to you. This is, and I'm going to give
Madam
you
Mayor,
slide
this
numbers.
is Councilman Johnson. May I interrupt?
Yes, and we're on current slide. The slide we're on is page 3. Just so
It's page 3, Councilman Johnson.
Yes, thank you. If you could please announce the slide, it'll help me follow along.
I will do that. And Councilmember Johnson, if you could just remind me, feel free to interrupt and remind me. Deputy Clerk Stanford did ask me to do that and left me a note. So, but if I forget, will you keep me honest? Please. Okay. So the current city code explains approvals and the process like this. Approvals by the planner are intended to provide assistance to developers in locating and designing uses to be in conformance with the neighborhood character and city-adopted policies and standards. The application and approval process is also intended to ensure that uses comply with other laws that may apply, such as state fire codes and Matanuska-Susitna Borough programs, including coastal management, shoreline protection program, and flood damage protection. So the approvals by the planner are tied to these specific goals and objectives, but what we don't have is a very deliberate structure to ensure that the planner is making decisions based on the language in the code that people can anticipate, and the commission is left with the discretionary decisions, those larger decisions that require weighing and balancing criteria against one another. And that distinction is what we really worked on in this section of the code. The revisions really are designed to create very clear lines so the public knows what happens when I go in for a use permit, what happens if I go in for a conditional use permit, and when am I at risk of not getting the thing that I want, right? And so we wanted to bring the code into a realm where if there is a use that is permitted in a zoning district, then that use is simply permitted, and any sort of, if it's a use that is permitted, but there are some things you want to see that are very clear, like for example, there might be something to do with the fire code, there might be some sort of license that you want an establishment to have before it operates. Those things can require a use permit, and we'll talk a little bit about a certificate of use is another way communities do it. But basically it's a checklist, and that on that level, then it is the planner who and the planner's designee, that would get a permit application in, and the planner would be able to sit down with the code, sit down with the requirements, and simply check, and say, you know what, you're missing this. And those permits can be approved very quickly. Or they can be rejected very quickly, and the person knows exactly what they're missing, and they can go get those things, or maybe they can't get those things. And they can also weigh the impact and cost of a permit or the things that it is requiring at the time of purchasing a piece of property or considering the use of property or a change in use of property. So that was really our focus when it comes to the use permit. When it comes to conditional use criteria, we did not, and we'll talk about the use chart next session. But when we're looking at what's required for a conditional use permit, that criteria didn't change. And that criteria is it didn't change substantially. And so that criteria is far more abstract, right? There's a lot of room there for the planning commission to listen to comments, to take into account testimony by the permit applicant, or considerations by various agencies or administrative staff that might weigh into whether or not it's a good idea to have that particular use on that property. And so your zoning district code, and we'll talk about how this works at the next session, but you're gonna go through this, and the planning commission will likely do work separate and apart, going through each of the uses in the specific districts, looking at those, and then you'll also have to think about how the comp plan is gonna come into play and shaping that, where you wanna put something. But when we're looking at a conditional use, the question really is, what is conditionally allowed in a place, or in a district, as opposed to outright permitted in a district? And if it's a conditional use, then what you're saying is, there's gonna be times where this will make sense for this district. But we've gotta look at what kind of traffic, we've gotta look at whether, what this particular lot, what the actual implications are to the other properties in the district or the community at large. We have to look at what the neighbors think about this, because this is a different use, and then everybody who is purchasing property or engaged in developing property in the city of Wasilla can say, I'm considering that lot over there in that district for my name your business, but I know that if I do get that lot, I'm going to be subject to a conditional use permit. I'm gonna be required to have that. And so that decision and understanding the discretion and the risk will come into play, and they can balance it. So that was the goal, was to just clean it up and make it as simple as possible as far as the tiers go. Councilmember Johnson, I have not clicked the switch at all. So I am moving now to slide 4, which is administrative procedures. Before I go here, because I'm gonna walk through each of the chapters, the most important thing is this distinction between use permit and conditional use permits, and I believe, so we have had, and that's why this session will likely be an easy one, our last easy one, but we have had multiple discussions, and we've been given direction that this is the direction that the council and the commission want to go, is to sort of scale it back. But I just wanna check in with you guys and make sure that's all we're still on that same page, because the session will be very different if we wanna change direction at all. No, okay, looks good. And does anybody have any questions? I know I'm moving quickly. No comments or questions, that's great. Okay, moving on. So, when the administrative procedures revisions, we really just wanted to point out the more substantial ones. There's not too many, but the ones that are there are pretty formidable. So one of the things that we've done is we incorporated a 5-year limitation on reapplication following the denial of a permit. And the reason why we did this is currently it is just there is a bar on reapplying if unless there's a change of circumstance, period. There's no time period put on that. But the change in circumstance, that's a flag for discretion, right? So what is a change in circumstance? What is a change in circumstance to me might not be a change in circumstance to somebody else. And so what is a change in circumstance to one planner may not be a change in circumstance to a new planner. There's this, and so in order to allow there to be some discretion, so you don't have a person applying every year for the same permit for the exact same use on the exact same property, which is likely to take up a lot of resources. The 5-year limitation, we threw that in because we felt like at least everybody we'll get another bite at the apple in 5 years.
Madam Mayor.
Councilman?
Colleen?
So as you apply this 5-year limitation, are you applying also a may or a shall? I mean, is it a directive or is there some discretion with regard to that 5-year limitation?
It just means that if you want to reapply and it's been after 5 years, you're going to be treated like a new applicant. You know, you can put an application in and the city will accept your application and consider it again. And they're not going to look to the use or change in circumstance. They're just going to, now they may, when considering your application, they may go through and say, you know, what's relevant is 6 years ago, you applied for the same permit for the same use, and we are going to deny it for all of those same reasons, you know, because they're all there and they're all still valid. So the city, to the extent they're processing an application that is the same circumstances, and it's 6 years later, the resources that go into that analysis will take far less because you have, but to the extent that it's changed, then, you know, that's giving the property owner an opportunity to try again and get that permit.
And does it, sorry, Madam Mayor, and does it depend also on the denial? If it's a very small offense and it's something they're able to correct or rectify within a certain amount of time, then again, couldn't you say, okay, come back in a year and let's try again? Because the other part is you don't want to hamper development and
No,
say,
exactly.
you can't come back until 5 years, so.
Well, and that's a good point, because it doesn't, 5 years is a random number. I mean, I picked it for this reason. And I'm an attorney, I'm not a developer, and I know I keep saying that in these, but it's important because I may be wrong. You know, I used 5 years because I thought a neighborhood can change a lot in 5 years, or what you see when you drive down the street in an industrial area can change a lot in 5 years. Buildings go up in 5 years, right? And so to the extent a permit was impacted by uses around it, or the uses it would impact, 5 years seems like a fair amount of time to pass. And this is just for a person wants to get a permit, either a conditional use permit or a use permit,
Okay.
or I guess a variance too. But that's a somewhat different analysis just based on the criteria. So I don't know, I mean, one thing I would say is, how do you guys feel about 5 years? Do you feel like you want that to be, would you rather have a shorter moratorium? Well, let's do this. Do you want a moratorium at all? Or do you want people to be able to just file for a permit whenever? And if you do want a moratorium, is 5 years, does that seem like a good starting place for, you know, this draft ordinance? And you'll have a chance to take it back up, of course.
Mr. Craig?
Thank you. Thanks, Holly, for your discussion there, but I can't even come close to agreeing with a 5-year limitation on reapplication. You know, you mentioned how neighborhoods change. You mentioned how industrial areas change. Building one building in a neighborhood, and of course, when we talk about neighborhoods, most people think about residential, but that's not the case. I mean, our emphasis is on commercial development here in Wasilla. But one new building in an area can change the whole texture of the area based on you know, the type of services that they're providing, or the types of goods that they're providing. And to be able to respond to that from an economic development standpoint, we have to be able to respond you know, through this administrative process here, this administrative procedure. When we look at the table here, those of us that are elected, 3 years from now, we could all be gone. Okay? Is the next council gonna be bound by this? Is the next planning commission gonna be bound by this? I would think once a year is sufficient, and the planning office can look through and say, you know, you filed the same thing last year and we found it to be, you know, unacceptable. What do you think makes it seem acceptable now? But you know, a year from now, 2 of us could be voted off. 2 years from now, 4 of us could be voted off. 3 years from now, 6 of us could be voted off. you know, or get smart and quit. But, but, you know, the 5 years does not allow for response to a change in the economy, does not allow for a response in the change to a building which could be permitted. Maybe it was on the edge of permissible and non-permissible, but it was permitted. And so now that could have effect on the best use of the property in that neighborhood. So I think once a year is certainly sufficient. And even though the planning department will go through a process to do that, I mean, they come back and they say, Stu, you tried this a year ago, what's different, you know? I mean, and the planning department is happy to do a pre-application meeting with anybody, not just people on certain things, but with anybody. And we need to make that available to developers and to business owners and to potential business owners so that they can respond to changes in the economy, in the neighborhood, and in the community.
Madam Mayor. I'm gonna have to agree with Mr. Graham here a little bit. I think the 5-year time frame is too long. Like he says, a lot can change in 5 years. Though looking at the red line section, we still have that as long as the applicant can prove that there was a material change in circumstances, they can actually bend that 5-year rule. Now, again, I think 1 year would be better. That way you don't have somebody continuously just trying to slap the same application. Granted, who has the amount of money to pay the application fees to do that? Though they're not gonna be, from what I understand with the new change, before you even start submitting your application, you're supposed to have a meeting with the planner. So if you're denied, it prevents you from continuously being able to go back to the planner and say, hey, let's have a meeting and talk about this. It's no, we already denied this. Come back to me in a year unless you can truly prove something's changed. I think 5 years is too long. I like the idea of dropping it down to a year, though I think having that minimum restriction on there at least prevents people from trying to waste our time, I think is what it comes down to.
Madam Mayor. Yeah, and I'm in agreement also that 5 years is way too long. But I don't think there should be a moratorium at all because like you mentioned, there are permit fees. They have to show where they have made a change before they could apply for their permit. So I think it's kind of redundant to even have a year in there. And they're not going to want to keep going over and over if they know it's just going to be rejected. So I would like to not see any time limit in there because I think, like Mr. Crafton pointed out, there's other things in there that would prevent that.
Rubio. Thanks, Madam Mayor. I agree with Nikki on that. I really believe if somebody gets denied, they want to fix it, right? And there shouldn't be a timeline on that. They want to go home, do their homework, figure out where they can get that approved as soon as they can. So.
Holly, I see this in a totally different light than the rest of them. But is this 5 year, they have, after 5 years, they have come and applied, and then they have been denied. They don't come back for another 5.5 years. You don't see them again. So they have to, because it's been over 5 years, they have to basically do a whole new application.
Right, so what is in your code right now was just a flat bar. You just don't let them come back unless there's a change of circumstances. So what that would look like, what a change of circumstances is, I think there can be, and there has been in the past, issues around defining what is a change in circumstance, right? And so, yeah, the way that this is written is the bar is just, they can't come back for 5 years, and I think this is, so maybe I'm missing the quote, but they can't come back for 5 years unless there's a change in circumstance. So it still keeps the change in circumstance, but after 5 years, they don't need a change in circumstance, because they can just come back. So it was intending to open it up a little bit. Just as a matter of law, I have no problem with opening this up completely. I don't know that a moratorium is necessary, and it sounds like there's a lot of reasons why people want to open it up. I don't, and I would say this, it's one of those provisions, if you decide to open it up, it should be on a list of like a monitor list that we create as we go down, so that planning can monitor it, because if it ends up being a decision that has significant administrative costs, because there are people coming back again and again, and the resources aren't there, or the fees don't negate those costs, then it can be brought as an ordinance or a revision for council and the commission to reconsider and add a different time period. You know, so this is one I sort of feel like I'm not a fan of the moratorium, like the lifetime moratorium or bar that's in here, because I think that, again, I think it reflects a lot of the same viewpoints. I thought 5 years sounded fair. I think all of you made really good points on why that should be shorter. I think then the question is, 1 year, do we want a 1 year to give some breathing room, especially, and I think the reason why a year might be something to consider, and again, legally, whatever you guys decide, we can write, and it's lawful, and I think it'll work. Some of these permits are emotionally and culturally exhausting for a community, because some of these permits, and I think, Mayor, this might be sort of what you're talking about, is really thinking about, in reality, the implication is you get a conditional use permit by a somewhat controversial use. Every neighbor, every adjacent property, they are dedicating themselves, moving their schedule to come and be a part of that process. There's notices, there's hearings, there's, you know, and it's a lot. It takes a lot, and it will dominate sometimes a planning commission meeting or 2 or 3, and so they can be very significant. So if especially industry wanted to keep coming back and doing that in order to, they can do that, they can afford that, and they may not have the same incentives to only seek the permits that they genuinely believe they're going to get, because they may be working towards a valid economic goal of putting themselves in a position to change the minds of the commission, which is completely fair and expected. But if you have that happening too often, I think that can create burden. But it's not a burden that you can't choose to bear, and I think we can do it, and we can put that language in. I think the question becomes, does that provide a little breathing room? So if the commission has been through this permit process and the neighborhood has been through the permit process, there's at least a period of downtime before that process starts up again.
Madam Mayor?
Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Holly. What would be the implication, or would there be a legal implication on 2 different things? Number one, I mean, there's a time limit for the planner to review a plan and to come forward with whatever needs to happen to the planning commission, if that's what needs to happen, or to issue the administrative approval, which we don't really do anymore. But to prevent someone from clogging up the system, which is kind of what you were saying, could we legally say, if this is a reapplication for a, substantially the same use or marginally the same use or whatever, the planner has, 90 days instead of 15 days or whatever to review that? That's be question number 1. And question number 2 would be, would it be legal or permissible for us to say, if you're coming back, for a reapplication on the same property for substantially the same use, the second time the fees are doubled, the third time the fees are tripled, the fourth time the fees are quadrupled, and so on and so forth. So there's an economic incentive for them to do it right the first time. Thank you.
Colleen.
I guess my question was, in how this was drafted, does the city see, maybe Crystal's better to answer this in the sense of, are we seeing a lot of applications come through that are deemed to be denied, but because they haven't quite fit the criteria or requirements of what they needed to do for a CUP or a variance, are they then put to the side until they get all the required documents or information submitted? In other words, is the city seeing kind of this huge onerous list of those that are not in compliance, and pretty much they're gonna be denied, but there's the gray areas, so you're putting them on the side and waiting for them to maybe get all their ducks in a row?
Yeah, we'll just share.
Sorry, I hope I'm clear.
So we've not seen a lot of that particular instance where they get denied and they wait a year. We have had instances like short-term rental where they're not a resident. And so obviously that's a denial. And so here's an operating business. There's one criteria they don't meet. And so in this case, they would have to wait 5 years. In that,
Well, I think that you would argue it's a change in circumstance, so they'd be fine.
yeah, but we have not seen an applicant come back over and over, because they changed the use of a piece of property. It's not very common.
Okay.
And so I will say too, so I have worked on a few things that where the planning department was in a position to say, sorry, you can't come back. There really hasn't been a change in circumstance. And this was prior to, earlier, probably a couple of years ago, actually. But when it happened, it did create, it put the planner in a position to have to decide if there was a change in circumstance and analyze a bunch of factors in that particular case to come up with the determination. And really the determination could go either way in that particular case. And that was one of the reasons why I do think it's important for it to be opened up. It should not be the change in circumstance should not be a requirement that applies forever, so I think that's one thing. It sounds like though we're all on the same page there. I feel like what I'm hearing from council and the commission members is we actually are wondering if we need it at all, or if we need it, could we limit it to a year? So I mean, what I can do, just so that it's a lot easier to strike language. It's a lot easier to be like, we don't want it at all, and then we just take the sentence out. We don't actually have to craft language in response to that decision. So in the next draft, what I'll do is I'll drop it down to a year. So we're preserving the language, and we'll put it on a list of things that we want to draw your attention back to when you're actually considering the ordinance. And does that work for everyone? So we're preserving it, we're remembering what we were worried about. And
Let's see a show of hands that who is satisfied with a year. And a show of hands that don't want any. Okay,
so I'll put a
Can we
year with. Can't really vote. Vote, fingers,
it's here.
yeah, right? So I'll put a year, but I will actually, we can put like a comment in there, that, consider removal, and then. Councilmember Sullivan Leonard, I'm sorry,
I said, what about up to a year? As opposed to either 0 or 1 year? What about up to a year?
The only thing is that creates discretion for the planning department to sort of decide when to ban them, and so I think having like a solid rule, people will know that. If it's not at all a rule, and they can just reapply, and I think this will give us time, maybe we can go and look and see. I'll show you the one that I'm thinking of, and you maybe, what we could do, staff and I can, with Crystal stuff, we can just see what it looks like. If this has not come up at all, except for this one, this one case that really led me to want to remove that lifetime ban, then maybe that'll change. Maybe 1 year is not necessary and you'll go to an open process. So we'll get information.
Madam Mayor? If I could, Madam Attorney, you can draw your attention back to the questions I asked.
Yes, to change the timing of reapplication, I think that that is okay, but I do worry because if you give, so if they have 30 days to process any application and then any application that comes, so maybe if there's a time period, you know, an application received in less than a year or something, you know, they'll have 90 days to process. I think that's fine, we can do that. My only thought would be less is more, and if you guys don't want it or you can limit it to a year, like let's just, you know, I think keeping it really precise and clean so that there's not a lot of layers is easier to understand in the end. When we start parsing through and wordsmithing, that'll be cleaner. But legally, I think your question was legally, is that okay? And I think that would be fine. And then your other question was, what if we doubled or tripled the fines based on whether or not it's, you know, when it's coming in?
Fees, not fines.
Fees, thank you. Yes, fees. And I would say that I'm less comfortable with, only because that might make a lot of sense to somebody who applied the next year, but if somebody who is applying 15 years later, you know, and then that's not gonna make as much sense, and we're gonna end up, we always have to keep our eye on the equal protection provision, clause of the Constitution, making sure we're treating people substantially similar. Or substantially similar people substantially similarly, right? So, which is not hard to do. We're looking for at most, this is a property interest. So we always remember that is a significant consideration. The more we can make things uniform, the better. So we don't, and it also matters in a feeling of, justice and fair treatment. I think when people are treated differently, even when we can justify it, a lot of times that contributes to frustrations. I think a really good example of that is currently the way that the permit application process is written and the way it happens in practice, how much time goes into preparing and spending time with a particular applicant, and when they actually find their way in front of the planning commission, that's not very uniform right now because there's a lot of discretion, which is lawful, but can be very frustrating, and I think it can impact the credibility of your system. The other thing is, I think we're gonna start putting some of these, like questions like this on a provision that we still have some debate. I think you all have still some debate in you on this one, so I'm gonna make sure we preserve the questions for that too. So when we're going through the ordinance, when it's been all cleaned up and it's formatted properly, and you can really see on all of your input has been taken into account, then you can mark through those, and then we'll have the questions lined up for each of those discussions, and we'll walk through together. So the next thing that the administrative procedure section that we do, this is in 160815. Councilmember Johnson, I'm still on slide 4. But we clarify the type of uses for which zoning permits are required. And so we identify that it requires pre-application meetings and clarifies required contents of zoning permit applications. We try to make it cleaner and clearer. We still, once we get your go-ahead, once we've worked through this, the language is going to get simpler. That's the one thing. We didn't spend as much time getting it to a sort of C-spot run level of communication. We spent more time making sure we got the actual, the substance of it communicated. And so once we get as long as you guys are okay with that process, our next step, when we bring the other draft back, it is just gonna be a little bit more third grade reading level, which is what our instructions are. We have not done that part yet, so don't panic. It's gonna.
Madam Mayor? So a quick question to educate me here. a zoning permit, number one, I'm not sure what that is, and is that something that would happen before the pre-application meeting, or exactly how does that work?
I'm glad you said that because that was a comment we got from the planning staff too. So zoning permits are just a generalized term to refer to all permits and for zoning. So the codes, many communities will call their code their zoning code, right? And so we call it our land use code, right? But it's a zoning code. It's about what you're doing and where you're doing it. And so we use the term zoning permit to be able to include conditional use permit, variance, use permit, and previously administrative approval, right? Any sort of certificate of approval. It's really just any permitting process under your zoning code. But seeing as there's been confusion about that because I think Wasilla has never really used that term. Like it hasn't used zoning code in a broad sense. So I think we'll change that to just call it a land use permits because I think that you called your code the land use code. But that's all that is it's just chosen language.
And if I could on the language, for the last sentence there in A, receive zoning permit, but receive the appropriate land use permit before they proceed with their project. I mean,
That sounds lovely. That's a great suggestion.
I'm a lovely
Good.
person. So.
One thing I would, if you guys have very precise suggestions like that, it would be great if you can just throw it in an email and send it to the clerk so she can send that to us, making cut and paste an option for us as we move forward. It's very efficient. So, but that's great. I like that language.
Madam Mayor, I wanted to ask a question around the pre-application meeting section of this. I really like the idea that even before they're submitting an application, it is a required sit-down meeting with the planner. I do have a little bit of concerns. I think as the city grows, obviously we might need to add another layer or somebody to assist the planner to help with that type of thing. Though, really what I was wondering was I noticed that the planner has the ability to waive the meeting. And I would like to make sure that if the applicant still feels that they need the meeting, that they have the right to keep the meeting and that the planner can't just outright cancel it for them. And I'm curious to see how the council would feel about that. If you're looking for where it's at in the code, I can point you out to it if you wanna see where I'm talking about. Do you wanna know? Yeah, okay. So if you're on the red line section, it's page 3. And it's under, so pre-application meeting is number 1, and the pre-application meeting waiver is number 2.
And what we're looking at here is the green bar.
Correct. Yeah, red lined is what it's called, but it's more of a
Right.
green line.
Right. And then the page number is up at the top.
Oh, it's at the
not
top.
bottom, I think.
Page 3 of 53 is what I've got on
At the
mine.
top and the bottom, so.
9, is that right?
Page 3.
It's page 57, 149 in the packet.
Confusing.
Yeah, it's kind of
Geez, Ian.
tough to follow. Sorry.
So again, just going back to my questionnaire, I think it'd be great if we just had an in writing agreement with the applicant under that to waive it, that the applicant has to agree to waive the meeting. Thank you.
I think that works, just having that consent. Great, we'll add that, and it'll be a very simple change with consent of the applicant, the pre-application. Maybe waived, and we might, at that point, we probably will just, we might even, because it's with consent of both parties, we might even just remove the qualifier, so as long as there is consent between the applicant and the planner, I don't know that we need to specify when it can be waived, because there'll be circumstances where they're gonna wanna waive it. It might be because they're trying to get somewhere fast, trying to get in front of the next commission meeting. That would be one. They've done it before, they've got their application, it's all together, there's no need, right? So there's a lot of reasons, or maybe they're out of state, and so they're just like, we don't need that part. we'll talk on the phone. So I think for this next draft, I'll just add the with consent and remove the qualifiers, making that simpler. Then one thing I would say is when we refer to the planner in the code, we define planner as the planner or the planner's designee. So even though you see planner, that really is, the planner might have, as we grow, you might be sitting down with a staff member, and that's really common to have, you might have several employees, depending on the size, sitting down and having those meetings. Usually with the larger, more significant, complex projects landing to, going to the planner directly, just because of the knowledge base they need.
Madam Mayor, just to follow up to it, as long as we can get something that says in writing, like, I want to make sure that the applicant has it in case they come in front of the commission and it's denied, that they didn't go, well, I didn't get my pre-application meeting. It's, well, here's the proof that you said you didn't want it. I think that's a big piece to that.
Mr. Graham?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And backing up just a little bit to 08.015, it talks about, they need the appropriate land use project before they proceed with their projects, that are listed down here. And one of the listings is a variance. A variance is a very specific procedure, isn't it, that results in its own permit? I mean, if you got the variance, pretty much you have the land use permit. Am I misunderstanding how that process works? Or?
Well, it depends. A lot of permits are reliant upon the receipt, getting a variance for specific things. There's some things that really you need a variance for, it really depends on what type of development we're talking about, right? So they go hand in hand. Often you are doing one and the other, but the variance process is very similar to any other form of land use. The difference is with a variance, the use is not something that's permitted. You're asking for permission to break the law. So that difference creates much more rigid criteria, and the way that it's applied is different, but you still need to consult, and often a meeting with the planner on a variance becomes very important because it's hard to understand. Probably the most difficult aspect of a variance for a property owner or developer to understand is fault. The concept of fault that justifies a variance is very hard to understand because there's a lot of things that a property owner will not think is their fault, but under the law is considered their fault, right? So, and it's explaining what that looks like and when you really qualify for a variance and when you don't. And they may choose to go forward, but that's an important piece of the discussion.
So a developer or property owner could get a variance and then have their project denied even after they got the variance?
Yeah, they can get a variance to build into the setback, but they could be denied use of the property as a dog kennel, right?
Thank you.
And that was just obviously an example, so it's not. Okay, so let's see myself. Is there anything else on that? Does anybody want to discuss? No? Okay. So one of the other things we did is we developed a uniform approach to addressing unlisted uses. And there's room here too to make some changes, right? But one of the things we wanted to do is make sure that the discretion that is placed on the planner to decide what a use is mitigated. And there's, oh, did I skip I skipped one. All right, I'm gonna go back. So one of the other things is streamlined process for city planner to adopt abatement plans for enforcement orders. So this one is pretty straightforward, and I don't know if So again, all of these procedures and processes is just creating clear directives and direction so that the steps are laid out, so people know what to expect and how to time things and what they're gonna be, what they're gonna be running into.
And did your review talk at all about, bonding requirements and return of bonds and so on, or release of
So
of
we're gonna
performance
talk,
bonds?
and we're gonna talk about bonding requirements. That's something that comes up just because it is, it's in the landscaping, so we can talk about bonding requirements in general, but we have tried to remove those from the code. We have, basically, the city has a lot of tools for enforcement, and you certainly could create tools for applying bonds and then, to require performance, and then you execute on the bond. But there are a lot of steps that go with a bond. There is a substantial, or a certificate of substantial completion, a recording the bond, so that if you have requirements or conditions and you have this bond and somebody has failed to comply, anybody buying property, especially when you're dealing with a developer, right? They can see that before they buy a lot from that developer. They know that they are not compliant. They can see that when they run their title report, when they purchase the property. There's a lot that goes into it. And so, at least at first, our step was to just remove it and use standard enforcement procedures rather than bonds as a means of enforcement. So we have removed those, but I do not believe that those are in this section. It's in the landscaping, which was another sort of oddity, right? We don't use them in every way. There's a lot of opportunity to use those if council and the commission wanted to have the bonding remedy and tool, I guess I would say. It's a remedy and a tool. We could insert it throughout, but it is not, has not been a part of your general permitting procedures.
So as a follow-up, I would like to see something like this on other cities and, if and how they use bonding, particularly, landscaping and paving, that sort of stuff, where it has to happen in season. I would be interested to see how other cities handle that before we do away with it. Thank you.
Great, yeah, we can absolutely do that. I can tell you they're sort of all over the board. Some of them have bonding procedures. Some of them have them in specific arenas, and some of them don't have them. They just rely on an enforcement process. So we'll get a comparison chart similar to your permitting comparison chart prepared. Anybody else? Okay, so moving to what is 160895, still on slide 4. Why don't we just turn to that one? So previously, you allowed a person to apply to the commission for an interpretation of the title as it applied to a particular person, and that the commission would then adopt the interpretation. The second part of that, though, was an allowance for or a requirement really, that the planner determine whether or not a use or structure fit into or constituted was a permitted use in a given zoning district if it wasn't listed. That's a big obligation to place on the shoulders of the planner. There's a lot of discretion there because there's a lot of different uses in this world that we have not anticipated, as detailed as our use chart is. So creating a system where the planner will look at a use and can say, oh, this looks like this, or it looks like this use, I think this is allowed, but the decision will go to the commission so that they can make that ultimate determination is a better approach. if you're aiming to preserve that sort of trust in the system that we've been talking about.
This might be a good time to draw council and the commission's attention to this comparison chart that we created, which is this large packet. And each page includes a comparison of 7. It says it's.
Oh, there you go.
I just didn't have it close enough.
I think
So
that's
this
an excellent idea. Okay.
This very large chart on each page includes a comparison of existing Wasilla Municipal Code to the codes from 6 communities across the state. And I think Holly flagged these for council and commission last meeting. The communities that we've been looking to as points of comparison within Alaska are Anchorage, the Fairbanks, North Scarborough, and Juneau. In terms of communities that are more populous than Wasilla, and then Soldotna, Kenai, and Palmer for communities that are less populous than Wasilla, but share certain similar characteristics. And so, what this chart does is it compares the process, the criteria, and the planner's discretion in several different areas of zoning permitting. And in some ways, this chart is not terribly helpful because different communities have such different approaches to land use permitting and use very different names and processes. But what we've seen generally is that most communities across the state use a 2-tiered permitting process where either a use is allowed in a specific zoning area and no permit is required, or an administrative permit is required, or a property owner would have to obtain a conditional use permit to have their property used in a certain way. But specific to the unlisted uses portion, if you flip to page 13 of this table, you can see a comparison of what different communities in the state are doing for unlisted uses. And what we've done with the draft ordinance that we presented is try to align Wasilla Code more closely with Anchorage, which utilizes a multi-factor approach to evaluating unlisted uses. Soldotna and Kenai also address unlisted uses in their code, but they rely substantially on the discretion of the planner to determine whether the unlisted use is similar to permitted, conditional, or prohibited uses. And then Kenai is on the opposite end of the spectrum and requires a application of the guidelines established by the conditional uses section, which is a more burdensome process. And so we've tried to strike kind of a balance between those two opposite ends of the spectrum and what we've presented in the draft ordinance.
Okay. Let me interrupt you, Zoe. Mr. Johnson, she is looking at the permitted uses table
On page 13.
on page 13.
Yes, Mayor, I have that. Thank you very much.
Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Mr. Crafton.
Looking at this, Holly, unlisted uses, this is where a lot of discretion for the planner, I think, is gonna come into play. We're taking away some of the discretion in other areas. This would be the area they have the most discretion. I mean, just being open about it, under the conditional use, which would be, if it isn't listed in the use chart that we have existing, it needs to go before the council at that, or commission, excuse me, at that point. And the commission after that one could also then take up a hearing around, well, it sounds like we need to put this under the table, and maybe they end up adding it as just a regular, what we call administrative approval, but maybe it's a use permit at that point. Though I think this, again, adds too much discretion to that position. That's just my opinion on it.
No, I like that too. I mean, okay, I think I got this back on. Oh my. We'll take one of those days. I like that. I mean, I think, I really like it going to the commission. I think one of the things we were worried about proposing that because it's more unusual, you usually have these layers of consideration before. I think it's completely appropriate to say if the use is not listed, then you have to go to the commission for a determination on what, and where it would fall, you know, what uses. And I think the only thing we would do in that case is just preserve some of this language about the substantially similar, so that the commission, because they're not gonna have the criteria they'd have with a conditional use, so that gives them the criteria, you know, what does this look like? So they don't end up making a determination that is, you know, you could have a use that's very, very close and similar to another use. At least the applicant will have an opportunity to point that out, you know, and say, well, this is just like this other thing, and, you know, and that way that conversation's a little more. But I would be fine with that, taking it out. And anything that reduces some of these provisions to one sentence instead of 40 is, you know, and is legally viable, and you guys have a reason for doing it, I love those. So.
Follow, Madam Mayor. Yes. Example would be if somebody wants to have an aviary, they want to breed birds, but we don't allow catteries and kennelries. Well, that's pretty similar, I would think. You could put those under those guidelines. What I think about this here is, it's not that I don't want to give discretion to a planner and have them have that ability to direct the city. I mean, we made them a director. They should have those powers, though I don't want it to seem like, depending on who the planner is that day or what the mood is, that they decide whether or not something needs to go before the commission or not. It should be very black and white, cut and dry. Obviously, we can't account for every case, so.
And one thing I would add too is whenever I talk about minimizing the discretion of the planner, in a lot of ways it's protective of the planner. It's designed to ensure that the planner can share their knowledge, and generally speaking, especially in a community like Wasilla, your commission listens to your planner. They understand the knowledge and certifications that come with that position. And so that allows for that information to be there, for those recommendations to be presented. It's just the ultimate decision that is made by a body of appointed individual, and that is that. So that's when I minimize the discretion, is never intended to undermine, you know, the planner or the excellent job that the planning department does.
Madam Mayor?
Colleen.
Just a quick question. So as we look at unlisted issues, I mean, it could be a number of things. It could be the height of a building that the, you know, developer is wanting to impose in the heart of Wasilla, and it's, you know, 20 stories high, and we've never had that before. So if it's not within our code, it's kind of an unlisted use anyway, so it would come back either to planning commission or to council via what, a resolution or an ordinance to change code if that's so, if that was a desire of the community to go ahead and allow like a 20-story type building. So I'm just saying, you have unlisted uses, but still your fallback is your code. You follow the code. So when you get to that gray area where it's unlisted use, pretty much they're gonna say no. And I'm kind of wondering, where would you say yes? If you have the code behind you, supporting you to say, no, that's not within our purview.
I think what it does, and so that kind of shows the benefit of having something, right? It allows the commission to say, I think the aviary.
Aviary.
Okay. So aviary, is that, okay. So if you had an aviary, if you had someone come in and say, hey, I wanted to get that piece of property for an aviary. Well, the planner would be like, well, that's actually not in our code. We have catteries and kennels, and we have all these things, but none of them really fit exactly what you're looking for. So it allows, it really would allow the commission, if we change it to the commission, but it shows, to say, well, we're gonna treat that, it gives them the authority to treat that use as if it is the other use. So it at least expedites it enough for them to say, well, we're treating this like we're gonna treat it like a cattery, and And since that is permitted in this with a conditional use business district with a conditional use permit, now we're gonna go through the analysis. So I think it would be pretty streamlined, but you're right, I see what you're saying is, I think what you're trying to emphasize is they're going to have to make that consideration, and it'll also trigger for them the next step, which is, hey, could you please provide an ordinance for us that adds aviaries to our code?
Yeah, just to follow up exactly, and the fact too is that the planner could not just arbitrarily accept an unlisted use just because she wanted to, she or he. It would be based on what the code says and kind of the feel of the community and planning commission and everybody involved. So I'm just saying it's not arbitrary. I mean, a director couldn't just do it because she feels like it, right? I mean, there's perimeters there for a reason.
No, those are good points. So I think what I'm hearing, oh,
Sorry. I wanted to just going back to what you said, Ms. Sullivan Leonard, was like building a 20-story building. To me, that sounds more like a variance than an unlisted use.
Oh, could be, yeah.
And I think that's a little bit of the difference. I'm the way I read this is I want to utilize this piece of property for this. That falls under unlisted uses versus a variance, and maybe it's just a bad example. I'm just trying to clarify what the difference between a variance and an unlisted use would be at that point. Or are they the same thing at some times and not the same thing at other times? How would that look, Holly?
well, I think a variance is really, it goes to something that's not anticipated in the code. So people use variances for both uses and requirements, I guess. So, and I would say it this way. You wanna build into the setback, that would be a variance. I have argued in the past that a variance does not apply to certain uses, but in reality, when you really, and that's true, but when you look at the structure of your code and what is a use versus what is what is something you're using on the land versus something you're building on the land, right? Like they bleed into each other, so. Oh, okay.
So one of the examples we've seen more than once is the ability to use your property for equipment storage. So you're gonna have all your winter equipment come in from construction season, you're gonna store it on your property. We don't have a permit that says equipment, commercial equipment storage use. We have junkyard. That's about as close as we can get. So in that case, when we got an applicant that said we want to store large equipment for our new office, we came before the planning commission and said we don't really have a use for this particular request. You guys have to make that decision. So it's been requested 3 times now for companies that are moving out here that want to store their large, heavy equipment on site, and they can't do that in our current code. So that'd just be an example.
Mr. Graham?
Thank you. I just wanted to come to a point of semantics here. Mr. Crafton had talked about the planning director, and I just wanted to make sure that I understand things correctly. There is no planning director. There is a city planner who is a supervisor, but a director in the city would be the level above the planner. So the planner actually reports to a director, be it public works or be it the administration. Is that not correct?
I think we changed that. Yeah. I think the planner is a director.
Is it now?
When I say we, I mean you.
Well, no, that's why I'm asking.
But yes, so the planner is a director level position. Yes. And that's really consistent with the majority of communities that we see. Because there is so much, as we go through this 130-page,
Right, and that's why I wanted to make sure the semantics were correct, so we can understand what we're doing.
Yes, we will make sure too that one of the things that we have done in some cases, we might grab language, so when we're all done, so you'll have to bear with us and be patient, when we're all done, we go through for defined terms and make sure we haven't used a term from another code, that we need to correct, because that's a perfect example, planning director. So if you see those, and especially if you guys are sending us any recommendations, please feel free, tell us all often. It's a very big code, and so we will make mistakes, and we need to get in front of as many of them as we can. I promise you'll have a very carefully read and reviewed document, but still. So when you see the semantics are not just semantics when it's in a code, right? So please let us know. So I am, for this next draft, unless, Mayor, maybe you can help me, just make sure my direction is clear on this one. I'm gonna take out the majority of the unlisted uses, and put in something that basically says if the use is unlisted, the commission may treat that use like a substantially similar use or a prohibited use after making those findings, and an application or something. Basically, we'll put something in that just really specifies, that just goes to the commission, they'll make a determination. Yes? Okay. We've cut out 2 pages, just a couple comments in 2 pages. Go team. Zoe, do you want to go through? Did you go through all of the ones you wanted to touch on, or?
Yeah, I didn't see a need to go through page by page. I think I just wanted to emphasize that in preparing the draft ordinance for council and the commission to consider, we followed what the majority of these comparable communities do in terms of the 2-tiered permitting structure. And then it sounds like we're gravitating more toward the conditional use model for the unlisted uses.
Okay, and where's the, let's see, I'm sorry, here we are. Okay, moving on. Councilmember Johnson, we are going to slide 5. Where is it? It's a big day. Moving right on. Yeah. Okay. All right, we have some questions that are more overarching, and these are regarding structures. Right now, the way that this is structured, there's a lot of information in a single, in the permitting area, I guess. The administrative and the permitting pieces are together. We would like to separate them so that permits has its own chapter and its own home, so that we can make that clear. I just want to make sure we don't have any problems with that. This is kind of a housekeeping matter.
So currently in the Title 16, when you talk about permits when you're talking about the permits in the code, part of that permit discussion could be the administrative procedures for getting that permit, going around that permit. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, so we would just make it so you have in the same section here's our conditional use permit, here's the application process, here's the criteria, but we have a lot of these. So what we have here, I'm gonna get you a better example. If we go to, so we have emergency actions and annexation and the zoning map, and we have these, which I consider sort of administrative, these are procedures, zoning map, and amendments of a zoning map, which is this is our rezone application, right? That makes sense to have rezoning in sort of a permitting chapter, but having things like annexation and any kind of clarification or definition of a zoning map. It's just too much for a person who's trying to just find out what kind of permit I need to do X. We just want them to be able to go and see all together the various types of permits without having to sift through some of the more administrative provisions. So not the administrative provisions of the permits, but of the code. This is what I'm saying. So one of the things too we can bring back is sort of a breakout. So right now, chapter 1608 is called administrative procedures, right? And it has your permits, and then it has your violations and your remedies, and then it goes into annexation and emergency actions and the zoning map and interpretation. So we just want to make it so that we're just focused on, these are the permits, and we're gonna walk through each one of the permits, or the types of permits. So then we'll be able to navigate it easier. So planning commission, for example, would not be an administrative procedure section. That's gonna be in its own sort of, I'm sorry, would not be in the zoning permit section.
Madam Mayor,
Mr. Crafton?
thank you. I'm almost wondering if this question, one called permits, one administrative procedures, would that be more of a website situation where I want a permit and I need to verify and find what type of permit I'm looking for? Would that be something maybe, Crystal, you could answer that question? We just make it easier to find on our website. That's almost where, I mean, because at the end of the day, outside of us sitting at the table, how many of us just sit down and read the code for fun?
Right, you're saying nobody's gonna read the code, so, but having really good informational pieces and documents, and that is something that Crystal's already been delving into, like how do we communicate this effectively and make sure they have materials and deliverables, so absolutely. At the same time, sometimes when you're responding, when planning's responding to somebody or they will hand them, because they don't wanna give them advice necessarily, right? They wanna lead them into a place before that's appropriate or when it's not appropriate. So it is good if it's organized properly, because instead of handing them the entire chapter, because there's 3 provisions that apply here and 2 in the front, they can, she can hand somebody 2 pages, and that's the entire conditional use permitting process. Arguably, we need both. I think that's would be the short answer.
Mr. Graham?
Thank you. So along that same line, Mr. Crafton, and once again, going back to the deputy administrator, I mean, we really need to incorporate AI into our website so that when somebody's looking for a mother-in-law apartment, they don't have to find accessory dwelling unit. They can kind of type in like Google, what permits required for a mother-in-law apartment, and then that comes back and says, oh, mother-in-law apartment equals accessory dwelling unit, and so on and so forth. Is there any discussion of that? I know you're always messing with the website. I won't say messing with, but always thinking about the usability of the website.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments. So our webpage was purchased 6 years, or maybe, I'm trying to think now, 4 or 5 years ago. And the intent of that RFP and the award was based on a very static environment. It's a place where people are gonna go, just get a few pieces of information, and then call us. And that, as you know, that whole environment has changed. Why you go to a website is to launch you into easy tools and give you direction. And so our contract has expired, will expire in July, and so we'll be going out for a new RFP, and that's gonna be one of the components of it. Because although some people really enjoy reading code, it's a really good way to chase off customers, and if you had a business, you would not eat. But it's also for our internal staff to have consistency, so they can go, and so when we have our pre-app meetings, although we're showing them the code, we say, okay, let's talk about trash management, and you'll find this in this code if you wanna read it, but this is what we would like to talk to you about now, how are you gonna manage your trash? And then we talk about utilities, so we always go back to the code, but we don't give them code. And I think that's been really effective in kind of a new way of doing planning. But our webpage should answer a lot of those questions at 10 o'clock at night when someone's trying to put a permit in. And that's the other thing is how we define a permit. If you go to do, right now, a short-term rental, it's under a license versus a permit. And so the semantics do matter. You'll be talking about that later.
other questions about the website? Because I will give that over to nobody. Okay, so one of the other things, I'll just say this, Councilmember Johnson, we're moving on to slide 6. But the one thing we do want is to always keep in mind, not just the language, which we will be fine tuning as we move through this process, but also organization. So if we start talking about something and you can't find it in the code, even though we're all on the same page or something, it's worth mentioning it, because if you can't find it and we are all on the same page, then there's a visibility problem for everybody, and we want to solve that for the public as much as we can, and simplify as much as we can. So as we talked about, we have removed the 3-tier permitting structure that the city has used, which was an administrative approval, a use permit, and a conditional use permit, and we have reduced it down to a 2-tiered structure. Under this structure, the planner, when they're considering a use permit, they are able to award that or deny the use permit with or without conditions, right? But they do that but those conditions are all specified when they're permitted. And the use permit process is a very specific analysis of the criteria for that particular use. And we really are aiming to ensure that the considerations don't require things like change of circumstances. Like, that is a difficult thing to consider. They don't involve things like harmony of the neighborhood, right? Because what I find harmonious may be very different than what one of you finds harmonious, right? So that is the goal of the use permit process, is to be really an administrative permit process. And what we're really trying to do with the use permit is make sure people are following the laws. Make sure that they have the building code they're supposed to have under the Madison Borough Code, right? And we make sure that they are paying their taxes if we're talking about a business, and that they are in compliance with their license. And so that they're building, that they're compliant, that they received the building permits they needed when they're supposed to get them. But all of these things, a lot of these things are governed by authority outside Wasilla even, but there's just sort of a check, and by the way, did you go do this? That should be a very fast process and an easy process, but we preserve the appeal process. So if someone is not happy with the decision that is made, they can appeal that to the commission. The conditional use permit process remains very similar to what it is, very little change. That process has been functioning very efficiently and well. It just doesn't function very often, and so we're not getting as many conditional use permit applications as you might find. So there might be an increase. The commission may find itself with an increase in conditional use permits. Not so much because of the 2-tiered structure, but when the use permit process gets much more administrative, just sort of a validation process, then some of the uses that were somewhere in between and then we're coming up as a elevated use permit, now those will just be conditional use permits in some case, or there'll be a checklist. That is going to be what we're doing in segment 3, is really working through and making sure, because that's not for us to decide, so you'll see at the next segment, we have moved all of the AAs to outright permitted. And some of those you're gonna wanna move back into a use permit or move into a condition, you may wanna at least start somewhere else, but that's the approach we've taken, so you'll see that. You now have, if this were to be adopted the way that we proposed it, you have outright permitted uses. And so then, what we need to do before we finalize the ordinance is look at the licensing provisions and make sure, for example, the mobile food vendor provisions in Title 6, I believe. So we need to go back and just make sure that everything is complementing each other. So if we've taken something out that we think is dealt with somewhere else, we are actually dealing with it somewhere else. So I actually just covered 3 slides, Councilmember Johnson. I am going to move, I think I just really ran through a lot of this. I'm actually gonna ask if you guys have any questions, seeing as I just sort of went through the entire permitting process. So I think we're on, landing on slide 9 on the updated district use chart. And so I talked about that too. That was a very effective sentence I just had, you know,
Madam Mayor.
so.
Mr. Crafton?
Thank you. So what I'm understanding here is as use permits are the new administrative approval. And everything that was administrative approval is now just outright approved.
Well, I think close, you know, I think close. I think that use permits are, so the new, all right, so let's break it down this way. And I know that you know this, but just for all of our edification, the only difference between an administrative approval and a use permit in the past was the level of notification. A use permit required notification to adjacent property owners or property owners within a certain distance, and so that that led to often a flood of commentary, but both are being considered by the planner, right, but subject to the planner's discretion, and they could be appealed to the commission. So what we have done is we have made a single tier that has components of both. The use permit does not have the notice and publication process of a conditional use permit. It has the notice and obligations are owed to the applicant for the permit. The planner will make the decision, and that decision is between the planner and the permit applicant. And it does not, it doesn't go to others. So that's a consideration when you're deciding where something lives. When there's a decision you think the neighbors and adjacent property owners should know and be involved in that, well, then that one might be elevated to a conditional use permit. And one of the reasons for that is the criteria for the use permit will be all of the discretion that was in both the administrative approval and the use permit under your current code. And see, that's why it gets messy, because under your current code, it had conditional use criteria for administrative permits. It just had the planner responsible for making those determinations. Now, there won't be conditional use criteria for anything other than conditional use. And the permits themselves will have criteria that are specific to, there'll be criteria that's overarching and generalized, compliant with taxes, compliant with local law, appropriate business license, those types of things. But for certain uses, it may require fire code certification or those types of things. So developing those, that will be there. But outside that list, if it's outside that list, if it involves really thinking about whether or not a use is something Wasilla wants, or that benefits the neighborhood, or that all is gone, and those would only be conditional use permits. So what we've done is, it's not so much of just cutting, for the district use chart it is, for administrative approvals, they just are blank now. And that means they're permitted, and that is the only change you see in the use chart. For the language of the procedures themselves, they're actually different. They don't just, unfortunately, it's not so easy as one went to,
Put it the way I put it.
Yes, it was very simple, I liked it a lot, but no, we can't.
Just to continue, Madam Mayor.
Unfortunately.
So one of the things that I believe is Mr. Johnson and I kind of briefly touched on at the original joint meeting was, let's just use an example of a single family home. That was an administrative approval in a single-family area, or R1, I think is what we call it. So right now, somebody could just go start building in a residential home in a residential R1 area. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, so long as they're complying with the permitting requirements for building a home. I mean, the borough has a building code requirements, so they'd have to meet those specifications. But yeah, right now, we would not, they wouldn't have a permit, they wouldn't have to get a use permit to use a residential lot to build a single-family home. That's all our use permit did. It was just for the use, right? So the question is, do we have a hole in our land use regulations and understanding? And that is, we need to remember to bring you guys, we had started preparing it, but we didn't finish it, which is sort of a, who's actually governing what on a piece of property within the city? You know, who is doing the building code requirements? What do we have to do, right? And what are the state requirements regarding a single family home that you build? And so understanding where other authorities start and finish. And I know that there's a lot of freedom in the borough to do a lot of building. There's a lot of freedom from some of the more stringent requirements you might find elsewhere. But understanding that is really helpful for you guys.
So being a realtor, there are no building codes in Alaska. The building codes that we utilize are the standards that basically make a home financeable. That's what we utilize. The only requirement from the borough is you get a driveway permit.
Well, I checked the code, and while there are no Alaska building codes, they do adopt and implement certain components of the uniform electric code and the uniform plumbing code. But I didn't go into the provisions, I just made sure that they had references to the code. So I'll pull those. I don't know, Zoe, did you spend any time?
Yeah, Holly, that's consistent with my understanding as well. While communities might not write their own building codes, and I understand that the borough doesn't have, borough-specific plumbing or electric provisions. They do incorporate these national standards by reference, so there are requirements that builders are obligated to comply with. And I think this is where that distinction that we discussed earlier regarding zoning permits and land use permits as opposed to other kinds of permits comes into play. What reducing the AA permitting requirement down to just an outright permitted use does is it just eliminates that land use permit requirement for certain uses which might be natural within a certain zoning district. And Commissioner, the example that you had for a single family home in a residential zoning district, I think is a good one, because that I think is a use that is inherently unobjectionable for that zoning district. And so the intent, and I think we heard from the commission and from council that this is the direction you were directed to pursue, was just to eliminate unnecessary permitting tiers where possible.
But I think, just to follow up on that, I don't think, so what I don't know is, I know that they refer to those codes and they have implemented them into the borough code. What I don't know, but will do for the next one, is actually look at how they govern. If it all sounds like what you're saying is they don't actually govern them. So they have referred to them, and so that's what I checked. I did not check how they were, or to what extent they were imposing them. So we will look at that, and we will make sure that we break down, sort of we'll provide you a breakdown of what is governing Wasilla's property and its parcels. But the one thing you may, we'll also encourage you to consider is, what are you trying to do? Because we don't use our use permit to impose building codes, right? Like, we're not getting there. We're not getting to those places with our use permit. The consideration is, but if we want to have a process that's sort of a certificate of use process, where it's just, then that can be something that some people use, some communities use that, which it's more just like, any chance we have to make sure you're compliant with laws and you're making you know, you're building a building that's compliant with the laws and you have the necessary requirements and permits wherever they may come from, we're gonna take that. Cause then, and we're gonna have you posted on your property, you know, so people know. So that's an option. We can do something like that if, you know, so we'll.
Can I continue, Madam Mayor? And that's kind of where I was getting at. I think the question, you had that question in here was, do we want to do what you call it, like a certificate for use or something? Certificate of use approach for general ones. And that's part of what was in my mind is when I sat on the commission, we saw two variances for basically the exact same issue. Somebody was building too close to the property lines. And here in the valley, it's the wild, wild west, as we know, and it's honestly pretty common we see things like that. So that's what I wonder is, I don't want to try and impose fees on people of, oh my gosh, I'm doing something that's already permitted in my area. Why do I have to come to you guys and pay X amount of dollars just for you to tell me yes? It's more along the lines of, we just want to make sure that you're going to complete the build entirely. You're not going to build like we see a lot of times where they're not putting siding on it to avoid taxes, and that they're building appropriately is more so where I'm thinking about that. And that's, I mean, I do like that certificate of use situation where it just says, hey, we just want to know what you're doing. We're not really going to impose a bunch of restrictions. We just want to know what's happening.
And that to me sounds more like a building permit, right? You know, so you know what I'm gonna do if this works? I'm just gonna go look and make sure that, because I do think that's more of a building permit, not a use permit. And so I just wanna look at the one area I feel I'm a little bit embarrassed because I do feel like I should have been more aware of the building code component for the borough. And I you know, so I wanna really understand that. I feel like this conversation is gonna be better if I have that knowledge base, and then we can look at the building code or the building permit versus the certificate of use. And we will dovetail that into our use chart discussion at the next segment so that I'm better prepared for that. So, does that work for the joint body? Yes. Okay. All right. Great. All right. Moving on. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the appeals to the Planning Commission or to an administrator, the administrative hearing officer, because we didn't really make many changes. This is page 10, Councilmember Johnson. So one of the things we did was we updated the interested person definition to clarify the city planner and commission cannot appeal decisions to the commission. This, with the structure that you have in Wasilla, where the planner is often giving recommendations and then drafting decisions there's like this administrative component or relationship with the commission. It's just cleaner, and so that's an approach that we would recommend. It doesn't have to be that way, but if you're going to have a system where there is that ability to appeal, then you need to create greater separation between those positions, and you really don't see that much in Alaska at all. This does not affect the ability of the planner and the administration and the city as a whole to appeal a decision of the commission to the Superior Court, and that's really important to remember, because often that does happens pretty frequently. Actually, which is a sign of a good commission, right? Because it's making decisions that are both aligned with the city and independent decisions. So, the other, so moving on to the next slide. I'm just gonna actually move on to the conclusion, because when I look at this, I feel like we really covered these other issues throughout this discussion. So on slide 12, we just remind the joint body that we will be discussing rules and criteria, landscaping and parking at the next segment, and we will be going through the use chart. So this is going to be, it's going to be a sweat equity session, the next session. I'm going to talk a lot less.
Yeah.
And we're gonna talk together a lot more, and we're gonna look at these various things. But that is, unless you have questions, that is all, Mayor, for segment 2.
Mr. Graham?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Holly. Going back to slide 11 and the discussion that Mr. Crafton was talking about, the certificate of use approach. I'd be interested to hear if in the city of Wasilla, a certificate of occupancy is required for residential uses, because essentially that puts the safety part of it, which would include plumbing, electrical, and other things, on the state fire marshal. And would we then be duplicating that if we picked up this certificate of use approach? I mean, we're requiring people to pay twice to do the same thing. I'd be interested to know what the difference would be there.
I do think that's sort of wrapped up in the same discussion. I looked at it enough to say, so when I looked at it, what I remember telling myself at the time is, there are these provisions in place. We should probably do a handout that explains them, but we can focus on our use permit. But now, in front of you today, I feel like I don't have the precision in in those details, so I need to bring those to you, because absolutely you guys need to know what that really looks like and what's being done by other jurisdictions before you decide where your governance is going to step in it. So I will
Thank
do
you.
that.
Any other questions for Holly? Hearing none. Is there a motion to exit committee of the whole?
Madam Mayor, I move to exit committee of the whole.
Is there a second?
Madam Mayor, I second that.
It's been moved by Councilmember Crafton and seconded by Councilmember Velock to exit committee of the whole. Is there objection to the motion? Hearing none, we are now out of the committee of the whole. The time is 7:42. There is no new business. We are on to audience comments, 3 minutes per person. It's a time for members of the public to share their views with the council. This is not a question and answer period or a time for dialogue. Speakers may be referred to the administration, or issues raised may be taken under advisement by the council or administration. Is there anyone present who would like to address the city council? Seeing no one, we will close audience comments, bring it back to the dais. Madam Deputy Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The next joint meeting with the Planning Commission is scheduled for next Tuesday at 6 p.m.
Tuesday or Wednesday?
Tuesday, February 6th.
Oh.
Yeah, because there's a commission meeting or something.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Do we not have?
That's what
The next regular council meeting is the 12th, February 12th at 6 p.m.
Okay, Madam Attorney.
No comment.
Said enough.
Councilmember Crafton.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just want to say thank you to our legal team here for all that you're doing. I know this is a lot of work and bringing you a lot of questions, and just thank you to the body for being here. I'm really enjoying this discussion. We're putting a lot of work into this. So thank you all.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Counselor. It was a very good presentation. No further comment.
Councilmember Rubio.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. To piggyback that, thank you to the legal team. You guys are doing awesome work. I'm not sure we really put much work into it yet, but we are gonna next time for sure.
Councilmember Sullivan Leonard.
No comments, thank you.
Councilmember Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, staff, for being so thorough on this. It's good to see, and it's also great to see that we're promoting discussion here, because I think that's an important part of government. Oftentimes, things just kind of get rubber stamped because they say, well, you know, the experts are there, they know what they're doing. And hopefully we don't have to be here past 7:30 to figure this out. But this is important that we spend the time here, and so I appreciate the staff preloading it, making everything ready there, and I certainly appreciate the commission and the council agreeing to come together to sit down and talk about this. So thank you to those folks in the audience. Somebody new in the audience, I haven't met you yet. I'll stop by and say hi on the way out. But, so we always appreciate that. And people online, I know there are people online watching, because I get quite a few comments after the last meeting. So thank you.
Councilmember Velock.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and I just want to thank everyone who came, and the council and the commission, and thanks to Zoe and Holly for all their hard work, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you.
Commissioner Sajel.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just want to piggyback what everybody said. Thanks to the legal folks for doing all this work for us, making it easy.
Commissioner Cottle.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. You have no idea, the legal team, how much we appreciate everything that you do. In looking toward our next meeting, I know you'll have a lot of work put into it, and it's going to be a very interesting, and I hope very productive meeting for everybody, because that's where we'll start getting into some of these hot topics. So I do look forward to it. I don't envy you some of the work that you have to put into this, but I do thank you for all of it.
Commissioner Seals.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I really appreciate all the hard work that the city and the city attorneys have done to bring this to a monumental head. After all the time spent in the landscaping and parking, I'm really looking forward to this next section. Thank you.
Commissioner Stafford.
Yeah, I like the other thanks to the legal team for not just putting all this together, but in a format that was easily digestible. And then thanks to the staff that's responsible for putting all this on YouTube. I couldn't be at the last meeting, but I've been able to watch it a couple times now on YouTube, and it's a great way to stay involved when you can't be here.
All right. Thank you to Holly and Zoe. This has been a long time coming, I think. It's time that we brought our code up to date to address the growth that we're having and the issues that brings with it. So hopefully with this, it will help us navigate some of these things a lot easier. So, and thank you to the commissioners, to the people in the audience, and to Crystal, and the planning staff that we have. It's been trying, to say the least. So they're doing an excellent job though. But anyway, thank you all, and I'll see you next Tuesday, the 12th. No, the 6th.
Then Monday the 12th.
Somebody may have to come get me, anyway. With no further business at hand, I'm adjourning the meeting unless an objection is raised. Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned at 7:49.
Have dinner next time.
Tim Johnson.
Are you buying?